I had worked at Meridian Regional Medical Center for 19 years when the owner's nephew walked through the front door carrying a MacBook Air and a title he hadn't earned. His name was Levi, 27 years old, master's degree in health administration from a school I'd never heard of. His uncle, the man who founded Meridian, who I'll call the director, had brought him in as the new chief of digital operations. Nobody voted on it. Nobody was consulted. One Monday morning, there was a memo in our inboxes and a name badge on a door that used to belong to my colleague who had just retired. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not a bitter man by nature. I had a good career, 22 years total in healthcare IT, the last 19 at Meridian. I started as a systems technician when the hospital was still using paper charts for half its departments. I built the backup infrastructure. I designed the failover protocols. When the Joint Commission came through for accreditation reviews, I was the one they asked to walk them through our data systems. My name wasn't on any plaques. That was fine. The work spoke for itself. Or so I thought. The first time I met Levi, he shook my hand and told me he was excited to modernize the tech stack. He said it the way people say things when they've read them in an article the night before. I nodded. I asked him if he'd had a chance to review the existing infrastructure documentation. He said he had skimmed it and he had some thoughts. He had thoughts. I told him I'd be happy to walk him through everything in detail. He smiled and said that wasn't necessary, that he preferred to start fresh with clear eyes. I went back to my office and sat for a minute just staring at the wall. That was February. By March, he had already scheduled what he called an operational audit of every system under my department's management. He brought in a consultant, a 24-year-old from a firm I looked up later that had been in business for 3 years, and together they produced a 40-slide deck called Meridian 2.0, Eliminating Redundancy, Accelerating Care. I was invited to the presentation. I sat in the back row. Slide 17 was the one that made my stomach drop. They proposed eliminating what Levi called our legacy redundant backup system, a layered offline data backup protocol I had spent 4 years building and refining, one that met HIPAA standards and had been specifically praised during our last 2 Joint Commission reviews. His reasoning was straightforward. The system cost approximately $340,000 a year to maintain when you factored in licensing, hardware refresh cycles, and the 2 staff members whose primary responsibilities included it. He had found a cloud-based solution that cost $84,000 annually, a savings of over $250,000 per year. He put a little green check mark next to it on the slide. After the presentation, I asked for time to speak. Levi gave me 3 minutes like he was doing me a favor. I explained that the legacy system wasn't redundant, it was the redundancy. That HIPAA requirements for covered entities specifically mandate that electronic protected health information have backup and disaster recovery procedures that are tested, documented, and not solely dependent on a single vendor. That our current setup used a tiered approach, real-time cloud sync, local on-site server backups, and offline tape archives rotated off-site every 72 hours. The cloud solution he was proposing replaced all 3 tiers with one, a single point of failure. I also mentioned that in 2019, a hospital in Alabama had paid $2.1 million in HIPAA fines after a ransomware attack wiped their primary system and their cloud backup, which had been improperly configured, failed simultaneously. I had that case study printed and ready. I handed copies around the table. Levi looked at the paper and then looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately. It's the expression someone makes when they've already decided you're the obstacle and they're just waiting for you to finish talking. He thanked me for my institutional perspective and said he would take it under advisement. The director, his uncle, said nothing. The proposal was approved 2 weeks later. I filed a formal written objection through our compliance office. I sent a copy to our HIPAA privacy officer, a woman named, she asked me not to use her name in anything public, so I'll just say she had been with the hospital since before I started, and she read my objection carefully and told me she shared my concerns. She escalated it, It sat in a queue somewhere. Nobody got back to me. Over the next 6 weeks, Levi's team began the migration. I watched it happen. I documented every step. I kept a running log, dates, actions taken, systems modified in the personal file I kept encrypted on the drive I took home every night. In late April, Levi called me into a conference room. He had 2 people with him, the consultant and someone from HR I had seen before but didn't know well. He said he wanted to address what he called my resistance to progress. He said that several team members had reported feeling undermined by my comments in hallways and team meetings. He said he needed me to commit to the new direction or he would have to reassess my role. I asked him to specify which comments had been undermining. He said it wasn't about specific comments, it was about attitude. I asked for the written complaints. He said it was more of a general concern. I said I would like whatever had been said to me in writing so I could respond appropriately. He looked at the HR person. The HR person looked at her laptop. Nothing came of it in writing. But 2 days later, I was removed from the migration project team. My access credentials to 3 systems I had built were quietly revoked. I found out because I tried to log in and got an access denied message. I called the IT help desk and they told me my access levels had been updated per a request from digital operations. I sent Levi an email asking for clarification. He replied that he was restructuring team roles to optimize for the new environment and that I would be reassigned to other priorities. He did not specify what those priorities were. My new assignment, as it turned out, was reviewing paper-based legacy documentation and digitizing records from 2003 to 2007. Files and boxes in a room that smelled like mildew. I was 51 years old, with 19 years of infrastructure experience, and I was scanning paper forms into a shared drive. I kept going, and every morning, I kept documenting. In the second week of May, the thing I had been worried about started showing its edges. Our oncology department reported intermittent issues accessing patient imaging files. The vendor support team attributed it to sync latency during the migration period and said it would resolve within a few business cycles. A few days later, the cardiology floor called the help desk because their monitoring system couldn't pull historical patient baselines, data that clinicians use to compare current readings against past patterns. Again, vendor support. Again, migration period. I heard about these issues through the grapevine. I was no longer copied on incident reports. I wrote up my concerns in a detailed memo and sent it to Levi, to the director, and to our compliance office. I outlined what I believed was happening technically. The cloud migration had not properly mapped certain data relationship structures from the old system, meaning that some linked records were not syncing correctly. I offered to help troubleshoot. I included my personal phone number. Nobody called. The director sent me a one-line reply, "Trust the process. This is why we have vendor support." Levi did not reply at all. Then came the morning that changed everything. I got to work at 7:15 on a Tuesday in early June. I had barely taken my jacket off when my phone started ringing. It was the charge nurse from our emergency department, a woman I'd known for 8 years, calm under pressure in ways most people never manage. And she was not calm. "Our EMR is down," she said. "Not slow. Down. We can't pull patient charts. We can't access medication records. We have 12 patients being treated right now, and we're working off whatever staff remember from handoff notes." The electronic medical records system, the backbone of every clinical operation in the building. I was in the server room 8 minutes later. What I found was exactly what I had been afraid of. The primary cloud system had experienced what the vendor would later describe as a cascading authentication failure. Essentially, a configuration error introduced during the final phase of the migration had propagated through the system overnight and locked the hospital out of its own patient data. The cloud vendor's support line had an estimated wait time of 4 hours. 4 hours. And the backup, the old backup, the one Levi had called legacy redundant and eliminated, would have had us restored in 40 minutes. I stood in that server room and I made a decision. I could escalate through channels. I could wait for vendor support. I could let the process work the way Levi said to trust it, or I could help. I had kept copies of the offline backup archives. Technically, they were hospital property. Technically, I had no current authorization to use them. Technically, in a room down the hall, 12 emergency patients were being treated without access to their medication allergies or their surgical histories. I used the archives. It took me and 2 of my former team members, who I called from the hallway on my personal phone, who showed up in 45 minutes, one of them still in the clothes he'd worn to his kid's baseball game the night before, 3 hours and 22 minutes to restore access to critical patient records. We didn't get everything, but we got enough. The ER got medication records. Cardiology got baselines. Oncology got imaging. When I walked out of that server room at 11:40 in the morning, the director was standing in the hallway with Levi and 2 people I didn't recognize. One of them, I would find out later, was from the hospital's legal team. The director looked at me and said, "We need to talk about what you just did." I said, "So do I." We went into a conference room. There were 6 people on their side of the table. I sat alone on mine. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. The director's tone was controlled, but I could see something behind it. Not quite anger. More like a man who has realized something has gone wrong and is trying to figure out whose fault to make it. Levi sat beside him and didn't say a single word the entire time. They told me that I had accessed systems without authorization, that I had used backup materials outside of proper procedure, that this raised serious concerns about my conduct. I put my documentation on the table. 19 months of logs, the formal written objection from March, the memo from May, the email to the director with my concerns, the compliance filings, the HIPAA case study I had printed and distributed at the February meeting. All of it organized by date, printed double-sided, and paper-clipped in sections. I said, I want to make sure we have the full picture on the table. I also said something I'd been thinking about for a while. I told them that what had happened that morning, the data outage, the clinical disruption, the 4-hour vendor wait time, was a HIPAA breach event under the definition in 45 CFR 164.4 none, that the failure of the new system to maintain required backup and disaster recovery capability was a violation of the security rule, that when the Office for Civil Rights conducted its breach investigation, they would be reviewing not only what happened but the documentation trail leading up to it, including every formal concern that had been raised and ignored. The room was very quiet. The director said, "Let's take a break." Nobody came back for 40 minutes. When the director returned, he was alone. He sat down across from me, and for the first time since February, he looked at me like a colleague instead of an obstacle. He said, "We may have moved too fast." I said, "Yes." He said they would need time to assess the situation. He asked if I would be willing to continue in my current role while they sorted things out. I thought about the boxes of mildew-smelling paper I'd spent 3 weeks scanning. I thought about the access credentials that had been revoked. I thought about the 11:15 on a Tuesday morning when I'd had to call former colleagues on their personal phones to come in and fix something that shouldn't have broken. I told him I appreciated the conversation, but that I needed to think about whether this was still the right environment for my work. He nodded. He looked tired. I went home that afternoon and I drafted my resignation letter. I did not send it that night. I sat with it for 3 days. I read it on Monday morning, and I thought about the charge nurse's voice on the phone, and the 2 guys who showed up in their off-duty clothes, and the 19 years of work that were stacked in that documentation file. Then I signed it and emailed it to HR, to the director, and to the compliance office. I gave 30 days notice. I worked every one of them. The day I handed in my badge and my parking pass, Levi was not in the building. I asked someone later. Apparently, he had taken personal leave. Nobody said why. I found out pieces of what happened after through people I trusted who stayed. The Office for Civil Rights opened a compliance inquiry approximately 6 weeks after the incident. The hospital had been required to file a breach notification. The outage had affected the records of more than 500 patients, which triggers mandatory reporting under HIPAA. The inquiry was focused on whether adequate safeguards had been in place, whether the migration had been conducted in compliance with security rule requirements, and whether documented concerns from staff had been appropriately reviewed and addressed. I was contacted by an attorney representing the hospital in August. She was professional and thorough, and she went through my documentation for 2 hours. At the end, she told me the logs I had kept were unusually comprehensive. She said it in a tone that wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite a warning. Somewhere around the same time, a former colleague told me that the contract with the cloud vendor was under review and that a forensic IT firm had been brought in to assess the full scope of the migration. In September, the director called me directly. On my cell phone, I almost didn't answer. He said the hospital was in the process of rebuilding its backup infrastructure. He said they were looking for someone to serve in a consulting capacity, to advise on architecture and help them come back into compliance with Joint Commission and HIPAA standards. He mentioned a daily rate. He said it 3 times before I responded, I think because he wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. The rate was more per day than I had been making per week in my salaried position. I told him I would need to review a formal scope of work before committing to anything. I told him all communication should go through my email so I had a record. I told him I was not available to start immediately and that any engagement would require a signed consulting agreement with clear deliverables and termination terms. He agreed to everything. I am careful not to say I won. What happened to that hospital those 3 months? The clinical disruption, the breach notification, the investigation, the cost of the forensic review. None of that is something I'm glad about. Patients were affected. Staff were stressed. Good people I'd worked alongside for years had a very bad summer. But I think about the charge nurse calling me at 7:15 that Tuesday morning, and I think I did the job. Even when I wasn't supposed to, even when the system told me to trust the process and sit down with my boxes, there's a word that kept coming up in the comments when I eventually talked about this publicly. People kept saying Levi got what he deserved. Maybe. What I know is that the knowledge in a person's head, the kind built over 2 decades of showing up and paying attention, doesn't fit in a 40-slide deck. You can eliminate the line item on a budget spreadsheet. You cannot eliminate what happens next. Levi is no longer at Meridian. I consult for 3 regional hospital systems now. My offshore backup rate is $285 an hour, and I have a 6-month waiting list. Nobody has called my work legacy again. I've thought a lot about what actually happened at Meridian. Not the outage, not the investigation, not the consulting contract. The part underneath all of that. The part that started long before Levi walked through the door with his MacBook and his clean title. Here's what I've come to believe. Actions don't disappear. They accumulate. Every shortcut taken, every warning dismissed, every experienced person quietly sidelined to make room for someone's nephew. None of that vanishes. It just waits. It waits for the Tuesday morning when the system you dismantled turns out to be the only thing standing between a functioning hospital and chaos. That's not fate. That's not luck running out. That's cause and effect, operating on its own schedule. The director is a smart man. I genuinely believe that. He built something real over many years, but somewhere along the way he made the decision that loyalty to family outweighed the judgment of people who had spent their careers earning expertise. And that decision had a cost, not an abstract cost, a real one, measured in patient records and federal inquiry letters and forensic IT bills, and a vendor contract that had to be unwound at significant expense. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because I think it matters to name it clearly. When you ignore the people who actually know how something works, you don't eliminate the consequences of getting it wrong. You just delay them and make them larger. What I keep coming back to is the choice I made in that server room. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was going to give me credit. My credentials had been revoked. Technically, I had every reason to step back and let the process fail the way I had warned it would. I couldn't do it, not because I was trying to prove anything. Because there were patients in that building, and I knew how to help, and I had the tools to do it. That's all. Sometimes integrity is just that simple. It's what you do when there's no audience and no reward, and the easier thing would be to walk away. The resilience part took longer for me to make sense of. 19 years at one institution, scanned paper records in a mildew room, access credentials revoked on systems I had built. That's a specific kind of hard, the kind that makes you question whether the thing you've been doing actually meant anything. It did. I know that now. The knowledge I built over those 19 years, the architecture, the compliance frameworks, the documented incident history, that was real. Nobody could take it out of my head by revoking a login. And when it mattered most, it was the only thing in that building that could fix what had broken. I consult now. 3 systems. Good work, honest rates, clear agreements in writing. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. But I do think about Levi sometimes. Not with anger, more with something like pity. He came in certain that experience was just another word for being stuck in the past. He's going to spend years learning what that misunderstanding costs. I already paid that tuition. The difference is, I walked out with the degree.